Sanctions Top 5 News, February 2022. In this video, ACSS covers the top 5 notable sanctions news from the last month. We will cover 2 OFAC enforcement actions, sanctions against Nicaragua, a call for sanctioning those responsible for sexual violence in conflict, and potential forthcoming sanctions against Russia. Number 5. $5 million OFAC settlement with Asian trading company. On January 11, OFAC settled with a Hong Kong subsidiary of Japanese trading company Sojitz. They paid $5.2 million for apparent violation of US sanctions against Iran. So, what happened? Sojitz HK employees purchased Iranian plastic from a supplier in Thailand for resale to buyers in China. The rogue employees hid the Iranian country of origin information, despite having been told by the company's compliance team that this was not allowed. Sojitz made US dollar payments through US financial institutions from its bank in Hong Kong to the suppliers' banks in Thailand. What is the lesson? Oversight, or lack thereof, of employees at foreign subsidiaries is a recurring OFAC misstep. Training that sticks and explaining the why of compliance is more important than ever. Number 4. New OFAC and EU sanctions against Nicaragua government officials. On January 10, 2022, in a coordinated action with the EU, OFAC designated 6 government officials in Nicaragua as SDNs. As a result, all property and interests in property of these persons that are in the US or in the possession or control of US persons are blocked and must be reported to OFAC. The sanctions were imposed in connection with the inauguration of Daniel Ortega, Nicaragua's president, and his vice president and wife, Rosario Murillo. Ortega and other members of his government are responsible for acts of political violence and spreading disinformation. According to an earlier New York Times article, Mr. Ortega's path to a 4th consecutive term in office has ushered in a new era of repression and terror. US Nicaragua sanctions are based on EO 13851 from 2018. In November 2021, US Congress passed legislation demanding more punitive measures on Nicaragua. The US is not acting alone. On January 10, the EU Council also imposed restrictive measures on 7 individuals and 3 entities in Nicaragua. Number 3. UN Security Council Yemen Committee briefed on sexual violence in conflict. A January 4 press release said that the UN Security Council Yemen Committee was briefed by Special Representative Patton on sexual violence in conflict on the situation of sexual violence in conflict in Yemen. As the result of widespread use of sexual violence in conflict in Yemen, she called on the committee to consider adding names of those responsible for such acts to the committee's sanctions list. She remembered them that the UN Yemen sanctions include explicit reference to the use of sexual violence in armed conflict as a sanctionable act. According to a 2018 research report, UN sanctions could and should be better used to prevent and curb sexual violence in armed conflict and address the impunity of perpetrators. This is an important issue that the UN and other bodies that issue sanctions should address. Number 2. OFAC settles with Airbnb payments, highlights risks associated with entering new commercial markets. On January 3, 2022, Airbnb Payments Inc., a subsidiary of Airbnb, agreed to pay $91,000 for violations of Cuba sanctions. The prohibited activity included payments related to guests traveling for reasons outside of OFAC's authorized categories, as well as a failure to keep certain required records associated with Cuba-related transactions. Airbnb voluntarily self-disclosed, and the violations were non-egregious. This case highlights the risks associated with entering new commercial markets, particularly one that has elevated sanctions risks, such as Cuba. Airbnb began operating in Cuba in 2015. However, it did so without fully addressing the complexities of operating a Cuba-related sanctions compliance program for internet-based travel services. OFAC said in the settlement that a failure to fully implement appropriate risk-based sanctions compliance measures into a company's infrastructure at the time of a new product launch or entry into a new business line, particularly one involving internet-based services, could lead to apparent violations of OFAC regulations. Lesson: make sure you involve your sanctions compliance team before entering a new market. Number 1. Russia, Russia, Russia. Russia. This is what keeps sanctions compliance officers very busy these days. A couple of developments. On January 20, Treasury added 4 individuals engaged in Russian government-directed influence activities to destabilize Ukraine to its SDN list. The individuals, according to Treasury, were acting at the direction of the Russian Federal Security Service, FSB. The FSB is Russia's intelligence service and also sanctioned by the United States. Russian intelligence services recruit Ukrainian citizens in key positions to gain access to sensitive information, threaten the sovereignty of Ukraine, and then leverage these Ukrainian officials to create instability in advance of a potential Russian invasion. As a result of the sanctions on these individuals, all property and interests they own that are in the United States or in the possession or control of US persons are blocked and must be reported to OFAC. These were common designations, mere additions to the SDN list. The big question? What is next? Treasury said that the January 20 designations are separate and distinct from the broad range of high-impact measures the United States and its allies and partners are prepared to impose in order to inflict significant costs on the Russian economy and financial system if it were to further invade Ukraine. What is next? If Russia invades Ukraine, US will unleash additional harsh economic sanctions, including sanctions on its largest banks and financial institutions. The EU will issue sanctions as well, either new ones or by expanding on existing sanctions. The UK Foreign Secretary told Sky News in a January 31 article that Russian oligarchs will have nowhere to hide under toughened UK sanctions.